to WomanVision TV. It's where women talk. I'm Nadia Giordana, and I have a wonderful guest today, Carol McCormick. Carol is a storyteller. Let's go talk to her and hear her story. Carol, welcome to the show. I'm glad you could be here today.
I am too.
This is great, and you're a storyteller. Tell us some things we should know about what it's like to be a storyteller, how you got started, things like that.
You know, we're all storytellers. I just happen to be professional storytellers, so I get paid to tell stories. And I got into storytelling because my first career was as a teacher. And when I moved to Minnesota, I'd been at home raising young children, and I was ready to go back into teaching, but there were no teaching positions. And I substituted for a couple years. That was not satisfactory. And I realized that I needed more of a focus. So I went to a career clinic and I tested out promoter politician. Well, that's not very conducive to having a family. And you can be in the wrong party at the wrong place at the wrong time, and even if you're doing a good job, and it's a lot of evening stuff. So I went to graduate school and I started working on a degree in gifted education to work with bright children. And in my case studies, I found that those children were low on self-esteem, that they were kind of considered know-it-alls. And I also explored and found that all the great leaders have used storytelling, because it is a way to wrap truth in a story and give it as a gift. So it's discovery learning. It doesn't depend on what I think is good for you to know if you aren't ready. And it isn't just chronological age, it's psychological age.
It's getting that message across without saying, you should know this, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And stories have different levels of meaning, but it's the smallest unit of meaning. So people, it combines the head and the heart, and people carry it with them. They remember the story.
Yeah.
And then when they encounter a situation and they are ready to learn the wisdom in that story, it comes back to them. So it's discovery learning, which is the most powerful. And I was also drawn into it because I feel like we're living in a time, Nadia, where it's so important that we live in love and that we have freedom, but we also recognize our community.
Yeah.
And by community, I mean our family, the whole human beings on this planet. And once you start exchanging stories, you don't have the same perception of them and us.
Yeah.
We're all in this together.
Yeah, and that's very important these days.
Yes.
Well, do you have a story you could tell us at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
This moment in time, I have chosen to tell a Sufi story, which is a sect of the Muslim religion. And it starts out, once long ago, there was a young woman whose name was Fatima. She lived in Morocco, and her father had many spinners who worked for him, and she herself was a spinner. And one day her father came to her and he said, Fatima, it is time for you to get married. I want you to travel with me on the islands trading, and we will look for a husband for you. And so they set off on the Mediterranean in a huge sailing ship, and they went from island to island, and her father traded, and Fatima at night would dream of the handsome man that she would marry. But unfortunately, she never met him. When they were off the coast of Crete, a huge storm came up, and the ship was demolished. She was washed across, out of the sea onto the sands of Alexandria. And she picked herself up out of the water. She was the only survivor. She had lost her father. She could barely remember who she was and her former life, because it had been quite an ordeal for her to be in the sea. And as she picked herself up and walked along the shore, a family found her. It was a poor family, but they had compassion for her and they took her in. They were weavers, and they taught her their craft. Whenever Fatima had some time, she would wander back down to the shore where she had come to their land. and she would be lost in thought, trying to gather the threads of her former life. And one day, as she was walking along the sand, a ship landed of pirates, and they took her and many others into the ship, and they planned to sell them as slaves in the market in Istanbul. On the way to Turkey, Fatima pleaded with the ship captain, but his heart was hardened. He saw how young and beautiful she was, and he thought, she will bring me a good price. Now it happened. On the day that Fatima was put on the auction block, there were very few buyers in the market. And one of the few men that was there had come to buy slaves to work in his shipyard. His business was to make those tall masts for the sailing ships. But when he saw the beautiful young woman who looked so sad, he changed his mind, and he used his money to buy her. And on the way home, he told her, Fatima, I will have you be a maid to my wife. Your life will not be so awful. However, it was not to be. When they got home, there was bad news waiting for them. The pirates had captured a whole shipload of cargo, and his business was destitute. He had to let go all the slaves and employees that he had, and it was only he, his wife, and Fatima who were left to make the tall masts for the sailing ships. Fatima worked hard, and the business began to grow and prosper. The owner of the business and his wife had never had children, and they ended up adopting Fatima. She was no longer a slave. She was considered to be their daughter. And one day her adopted father came to her and he said, Fatima, I want you to be my agent. I'm getting old and I no longer want to go trading. I want you to take a cargo of masts to Java. And so, once again, Fatima found herself on one of the tall sailing ships. When they were off the coast of Java, a typhoon struck, and once again the ship was demolished, and Fatima was washed on the shore of China. She got up off the sand and she raised her fist to heaven and she said, Why? Why me? Every time I'm happy and my life is working out, another shipwreck. Why? There was no answer. So she picked herself up and walked until she came to a village. Now the people in that village didn't know of this young woman's misfortunes, but they did know of a story. For generations there had been a story told that someday a foreign woman would land on the coast, and when she did, she was to be taken to the emperor. So they took this woman to the emperor's throne, and he looked at her and he said, Lady, can you make me a tent? I think so, she said. She asked first for strong rope, and there was none to be had. Remembering her time spinning in Morocco, she got hemp and she spun and braided the strong rope. And then she asked for tall sailing masts. They didn't have it. So she took crews into the forest to fell the tall, tall trees and strip them of the branches and the bark and made those tent poles. Then she asked for sturdy tent cloth, and they had none. They had brocades and silk. Remembering her time with the weavers of Alexandria, she wove that sturdy tent cloth. And then she went into her mind's eye and she remembered all the tents she had seen in the lands in which she had lived. And she put the rope and the poles and the cloth together and made a magnificent tent for the Emperor of China. He was so delighted, he made her a member of his court. And a few years later, she married one of his sons, a Chinese prince. It was many, many years later when she was a great-grandmother, surrounded by her great-grandchildren, telling them stories, that she suddenly realized all those misfortunes were necessary for her to find her ultimate happiness.
Great story. It just gives me goosebumps. I was fascinated, lost in time while you were telling that story.
And that's why I became a storyteller, to be a wise old woman,
Yeah.
to see above the fray, you know.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm sure your audiences love it. And you wrote a book too, and that book is called A Bridge for Grandma. Hold that up for just a second. And how did that book come about?
In working in schools, I do artist residencies on storytelling, and working in daycare centers, I encountered some children that were traumatized because it had been a sudden death of a loved one, a teacher, a parent, a grandparent, and I went looking for something to help those children, and all I found were books about squirrels and trees and poetry, and as a teacher, I taught young children. I knew how concrete they were. So I worked with a resuscitation pediatrician. I had pictures that children had drawn when they had had what they call a near-death experience. They were medically dead and came back on their own, or he had resuscitated them. And then I worked with an interviewer, a researcher, who'd had 5 NDEs herself and had interviewed 177 children who'd had a near-death experience. She, PMH Atwater, has a number of books for adults, but nothing for children. And so I wrote a story in the first person, although I've never had a near-death experience, of a little girl going through that. And children are always met, so they won't be afraid. And it was her grandpa, who had died 3 years ago, that met her when she left her body.
Sure.
And they flew to heaven. The children all used the word heaven. And their pictures were very different in their styles. But heaven for them was always trees and rainbows and butterflies. It was a beautiful place. And they, depending on how they were raised, they might talk about Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha, but they all talked about meeting the light. That was this love that was so encompassing, and the light told them they had to go back. So when she goes back, her parents don't really want to talk about that, but her grandma, who misses grandpa, is delighted to hear the story. And that she was so young when her grandpa died, so they start a scrapbook of memories for them. And then as the grandmother ages, it goes through her illness and her death. And she tells the little girl, you know, that I'm not afraid because of the story that you told me. It's a bridge for her. And so it goes through the funeral of the grandmother, and at the end, the little girl is holding the scrapbook that they've made together and realizing she has these memories. And also at the end, I validate what the children themselves have told me, that sometimes they'll wake up at night and they'll see a grandparent standing by their bed, or they'll be in, or they'll be in a dangerous situation like a fire, and they'll hear a voice, a grandparent's voice or a parent's voice, or it's a situation where they're very happy and they'll feel a touch and recognize it's that loved one. So it's almost like the person that they loved is a guardian angel for them. And it's to encourage children to know that we don't have those people that we can touch, like a physical, but we still can have relationship with them.
What a great book.
Making death is part of life.
Yeah, it really is. So it's really good for kids. I'm sure they really enjoy it.
I've had feedback that some 3- and 4-year-olds ask for this book every night when their parents have died in an accident or there has been a murder, and they're really too young to get it, but I also have a very good artist for it, and pictures are.
I know that artist. She's been on this show. I love her. And we just a few minutes left, some words of wisdom.
Well, there's one story that I wanted to let everyone have. It's the oldest story I know, and when you tell it, you have to tell it in exactly these words because it's tongue polished. It's like stew. It's been simmering a long time. There was once a woman who lived in hell. She could leave at any time. She never did. She knew the names of the streets.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.